Thank you, Damon, for a couple of big reasons. First, for your stewardship and leadership of the Tamer Center with Bruce. As Damon said, the Tamer Center is very distinctive among business schools. We have a view at the school that this is not something simply about training a small group of students for life in the not-for-profit sector. It's about every business school student having a broader context. And that leads me to the second reason to thank you, which is on the subject of this conference on inequality. That is a subject that means different things to different people. One can talk about ex ante or ex post. One can talk about mobility versus absolute measures of inequality. They're all important, all different in the context of policy. I wanted to spend my time with you on trying to do some table setting for what I think is an incredible day that has been put together for you. And I wanted to focus on 3 R's: review, why are we here; research, which is what you're going to be talking about; and responsibility, which is where I'll spend most of my time, why I think every business school student has a responsibility here, and every business person. That's a code word for all of us. To frame what I wanted to say, a couple of weeks ago I had a debate with Larry Summers at Yale Law School on this topic, and Larry said, well, Ivy League professors are actually more hated than business people by the general public. And I said, no, Larry, only you are more hated than business people. But I actually think he was onto something. We have for years, whether it's economists like me, or you'll also hear today from psychologists, sociologists, all of us in academia have been offering our advice, our silver bullets, our great words. And I think that part of what is missing is stepping back. I got interested in economics because of Adam Smith, the real Adam Smith, not the guy who wrote Money, the actual Wealth of Nations, Theory of Moral Sentiments, because my view was much like Scottish Enlightenment thinkers that the goal of an economic system is mass prosperity. And mass prosperity in and of itself, which was the Scottish watchword, really was about opportunity. And part of that is understanding where opportunity comes from, but also to make sure that we know what it is. One of the reasons the school became so heavily involved in things like the Youngstown excursion, and that we repeated in other cities, was to make sure that Columbia Business School students and Columbia Business School faculty, to be sure, were aware of challenges elsewhere in the economy. One can live in New York and live in a bubble. The origin for this excursion came from a debate or conversation that Ray Horton, a colleague, and I had with the students right before the 2016 election. Ray is from rural Iowa. I am from the rural South. Both of us are from very different places than New York City. Everybody from where we were from was voting for Donald Trump. And both of us were scratching our heads. And this led to the Youngstown excursion. My purpose in talking with you here is to say why this is central to business people and business schools. I actually think it's an economic imperative. I can look at you and tell that your favorite course in college was Econ 101. It was my favorite course, I assume it's yours. And when the professor talked about technological change or globalization, when you took Econ 101, and those are the tectonic plates that are shifting beneath us that lead to the discussions that you all will talk about today, the professor probably mumbled something like, this is better for all of us on average. And of course, since the gainers can compensate for losers, that means it's a win-win. The problem is, while globalization and technological change have been the tectonic plates of our economic age, we really haven't been maintaining broad support for a dynamic economy, meaning gainers, code word for all of you, all of my students, have not necessarily been compensating the losers. And as a result, what worries me as an economist is not whether the economy going forward can grow at a pace that support the living standards Americans are used to, but whether we'll have political support for the kind of dynamic system that can lead to that growth. So, because I don't have a lot of time with you, I just wanted to mention 3 things. Growth itself, the preparation for participation in society and support, GPS, if you will. Let me start with growth. It is said today that growth is irrelevant. We've got to focus on inequality. Rising tides don't lift all boats. Do not believe that. Growth remains the central challenge. If we can't have growth, we don't have rising living standards. You can't slice a pie that isn't baked. We have to begin with growth. I would refer you to a study that Jason Furman did for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors in 2015, just pointing out that for today's middle-income worker, if that middle-income worker had benefited from the productivity growth of the halcyon days from 1948 to 1973, that worker, but had the same income distribution that many people are concerned about today, that worker would be $30,000 a year richer. That's a big deal for an average worker. If instead we had poorer productivity growth, but went back to the older, more favorable income distribution, that worker would only be $9,000 a year better off. Growth matters. But growth in and of itself isn't the answer. And I expect this is why this rings hollow with a lot of voters, because we aren't really preparing people writ large for the world of work. Now, from where I come from, having a leadership position in higher ed, people like me go to Congress and talk about institutions like mine, like Columbia University. It's a great place. It's not the answer to these challenges, as much as this conference is useful. The answer to this challenge really lies more with institutions like community colleges that are spread throughout the country, who have done successfully partnerships with local businesses. A colleague in an Aspen Institute project, Austin Goolsbee, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and I have put out an idea for a federal block grant to support community colleges. And our idea is actually pretty simple. If you look at the earnings gap, people who complete at least an operative word here is complete at least a community college education and move to work earn 65% more on average than non-college grads and twice as likely to be employed. And Austin's, in my view, was rather than focusing on what people currently talk about, which is free tuition or financial aids or demand side subsidies, let's go back to the supply side and try to figure out what can we do to make more community college opportunities available. So we wanted greater public investment to increase the supply of at least some college-educated workers, increasing opportunity for mid-career workers who often are community college students, and provide better pathways to the workforce. Specifically, the ideas we had were two. We wanted to close the completion gap between two-year college students who are 18 to 24 and four-year peers by moving that rate from 37.5% to 60% by the year 2030. And we felt that that was an ambitious goal, but a doable goal with a heavy emphasis on completion. We also then wanted to take the workforce more generally, so take the share of Americans who are between 25 and 64 without a college degree or other high-quality credential from where it is now, about 46%, to 65% by 2030. We didn't pull 65% out of the air. It happens to be what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says the expected share of jobs requiring that credential by 2030 will be. In the weeds, we have a lot of proposals for accountability, and again, a temporary program through 2030. A lot of this is about supporting completion. There are a number of interventions community colleges take to get people through programs and get them to the pathway to work. In an era where people talk about $2 trillion infrastructure projects as if they're free, or modern monetary theory, what we're talking about is a set of programs that would probably cost about $20 billion a year. Is that a lot? Well, it's certainly a lot relative to the Columbia Business School budget. It, however, is something that is doable for the United States, either by changing the way in which we support old age programs for higher income people, or even through raising taxes. What it's not is a pure demand side expansion. Demand side expansions of financial aid, while they sound good to voters, really bid up the price of education. They don't increase the quantity of education. The intuition that Austin and I had on this is really old. It actually comes from Lincoln. When I hear that we can't right now solve big problems because we have this, we have China, we have the budget deficit, whatever your favorite attack is, I would remind you that in the middle of the Civil War, a stressful time, President Lincoln put forth the Morrill Act, the land grant college block grant from the federal government, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act. These were bulldozer legislation proposals from President Lincoln, who wanted to jumpstart opportunity. Obviously, emancipation is the most famous manifestation of Lincoln's emphasis on opportunity, but these other pieces were important as well, so that the pedigree for this is actually quite large. So growth matters, preparedness matters, but support also matters. We were talking at the table before Damon opened the conference about today being the jobs report day. So in a few minutes, we'll have the federal jobs report. It comes out at 8:30 in the morning, first Friday of the month. And one of the things that I was worrying about at the table was the support for work. In other words, if we simply are counting jobs that can be fairly low wage, we might have a misrepresentation in our heads about how healthy the actual labor market is. Getting people on the ladder of work is incredibly important. If you want to advance in your career, work is absolutely central. It is very hard to go from pure training into the middle or top echelons. I hate to say this as a professor, but most of what you learn in life is actually on the job. And so you have to have a job to do that. Tangibly, what support would mean is increasing federal support for work. We currently in the United States have a program called the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's supposed to be just that. What it in fact is more a family support program than it is a work support program. We need to redouble our efforts for childless workers as a code word for younger workers who need our support to get started. This is important not only to move people up the ladder, but to have the dignity that work brings. In addition, we need to recognize that the job market people are in, particularly low-wage workers are in, is very different from the era in which our labor market programs were actually created. Most of the classic US labor market programs go back to the 1930s. And they go back to a period of time where the problem was temporarily being out of work and then being reattached. That, of course, isn't the problem of our age. And the question is how to reconnect people for something new. I already mentioned the preparedness angle here, which is things like community colleges and partnerships, but we also need to rethink how we support workers in transition. Right now, if you would become unemployed, you would go to an unemployment office, they would assign you a propensity score, a statistical score, of your likelihood of being unemployed for a long period of time. They do that to help you get access to a number of federal training programs. Another route, I would argue a better route, would be to connect you to personal reemployment accounts, which would be funds for you in retraining and a bonus for early reemployment. So support, I think, is just as important as preparation and growth. Now, what about funding? How do you pay for this? I know today you're supposed to say everything can be done for free. I actually don't believe that. But we're a nation that has to set priorities. And to me, we are spending so much on the affluent in our social insurance programs. Surely, we can cut this back to refund opportunity for people that we want to bring along. But I would actually go back to where I began. Why I'm really interested in this isn't just the economics, although that's enough for people like me. It's that it's a social imperative. Whenever I give talks on growth and I talk about where I think productivity growth is going to be based on my discussions with technologists and business people, I'm very optimistic. What I'm more worried about is, again, whether our political system will allow that growth to occur. That's a code word for thinking about whether we have the social support for a market economy. And you have to have a social support system by getting everybody in. Classically, when economists have talked to politicians, if you think about growth as being a boat where the engine goes fast or slow, we've told politicians to speed up the boat, as if everybody swimming can just catch up to the boat no matter how fast it's going. I would suggest to my profession and to politicians maybe a different analogy. Let's make sure we get more people in the boat, and then we will speed up the boat. This focus on mass prosperity is really what drove the school's interest in the Youngstown trip. I think anybody who went on that trip, myself included, learned a lot. I reminded my colleagues, we're not there to teach or preach. We are there to learn. And I think we learned that the solutions are hard. They do involve work, yes, but they involve issues of dignity and community. I wanted to conclude by saying something that's perhaps odd for an economist. Normally, in my profession, we look at the data, we come up with policy ideas. That's what Austin and I did. But I also think that we need to reimagine the process coming together. I mentioned the debate with Larry at Yale Law School. At that event, Bob Schiller, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, gave a dinner talk where he said, you know, what brought Americans together, if you want to see Americans with a more communal spirit today, the closer in age you are to the World War II generation, the more communal you are. And unfortunately, Bob just left it there. Now I thought, wow, so I was having my cup of coffee. Does this mean we need World War III to bring the country back together? Now, I don't think we do. But I think we need a sense of national purpose. And I'll be writing in the coming months on national service as one such option. I think we need to think hard about ways to bring Americans together, young people and older people, in a sense of national purpose that doesn't involve the war. To stop where I began, though, I want to commend Damon and Bruce and the Taylor Center for all you're doing. I think this program today is incredibly important. Personal views on studying inequality for a long time are more about inequality of opportunity, but I think you should look at all of the dimensions. They are all extremely important, and you're right at the nub of the social issues in the country today. So thank you for having me. I hope you have a great day. Thanks.